Hi, everybody. My name is Diane Provito, and I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum Instruction and Research. And I am joined this evening by several wonderful and esteemed guests. I'd like to introduce them to you now. We're here with Dr. Jay Itzkowitz, who is the Clinical Chair of the Emergency Department at Mount Sinai South Nassau Hospital. And he will present to us an overview of the effects of marijuana use. We also have Sarah Dowler, our Oceanside High School health teacher, Allison Erickson, who is the project coordinator of Oceanside Safe Coalition and a licensed social worker. We have Allison Glickman Rogers, our principal of Oceanside Middle School. And finally, Pam Izzy, who is the director of the Long Island Prevention Resource Center. So we are very happy that you are all here joining us this evening. We do recognize that we have families, community members, and of course, some of our wonderful staff members. For our staff members, at some point throughout this broadcast, we are going to be putting a link for the attendance in the comment bar. So be on the lookout for that. If for any reason that isn't working through this broadcast, we will just ask you to, if the comment box is working, write your name. But please don't worry about it. No matter what, we'll make sure that we gather your attendance. And without further delay, I am going to turn it over to Allison Erickson.
Thank you so much, Diane. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being on call tonight for tonight's workshop. We're going to be starting our presentation now with addressing the effects of marijuana legalization on youth, brought to you by the Oceanside Safe Coalition and Oceanside School District. So just a quick overview of the agenda this evening. Obviously, we're going to start with me. I'm going to go over a little bit of information concerning marijuana legalization as it currently stands. So just a quick review for everyone to make sure we're all on the same page as far as what legalization means and what that also means for our local communities under the town of Hempstead for Oceanside. We're going to then go to Dr. Jay Itzkowitz, and he's going to talk more about the effects of marijuana use on the teen brain. Sarah Dowler will then go over a community approach to prevention, giving a little bit more information about Oceanside Safe Coalition, how you can get involved, and a little bit about what our school district is doing as well. Then we'll wrap up with Dr. Glickman Rogers, who's going to go over some proactive factors and some helpful information about how you can integrate prevention education at your home. So a quick review of marijuana legalization. So we all know that on March 31st, 2021, Governor Andrew Cuomo signed the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. So what that did was legalize adult use of cannabis or recreational marijuana in New York State, keyword being adult use. The legislation creates a new Office of Cannabis Management, which is governed by a Cannabis Control Board to oversee and implement the law. So the Office of Cannabis Management, also known as OCM, will issue licenses and develop regulations outlining how and when businesses can participate in this new industry. The OCM will also oversee the state's existing marijuana, medical marijuana program and cannabinoid hemp program, which was previously regulated by the Department of Health. It's very important for us to know as a community that there are key provisions from the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, which do impact local governments and our local officials. So an overview of what exactly is in the law. Possession and use of cannabis by adults 21 years of age or older is now legal in New York State. So New Yorkers 21 years of age and older can grow up to 6 cannabis plants in their home for personal use and a maximum of 12 plants per household. The home cultivation of cannabis is only permitted after the Office of Cannabis Management issues regulations governing home cultivation of cannabis. So there are many regulations that have not yet been set under the Office of Cannabis Management, and that's a very important thing for us to remember. So this will occur within 18 months of the first adult use retail sale. These regulations will be put in place, hopefully. Cannabis plants must be kept in a secure place, not accessible to any person under 21. So a lot of the same things that we would be doing at home with locking up our alcohol, making sure that our alcohol is not available to any persons under 21, we would obviously do if we have any cannabis plants or any cannabis products in the home. Home cultivated cannabis cannot be sold to anyone. It is only intended for personal use. Adults over 21 can possess up to 3 ounces of cannabis and 24 grams of concentrated cannabis. So that's a vaporization oil or an edible. Adults may possess up to 5 pounds of cannabis at their personal residence or grounds. Personal possession over the legal limit and any unauthorized sale of any amount of cannabis is still illegal. The current regulations that we have under New York State, there are licenses required for retail and consumption sites if they are implanted in our community. No sales under 21, and dispensaries cannot be within 500 feet of a school, which really, if you think about it, is not that far, or 200 feet from a place of worship, also not that far. So those are the only regulations that are currently set under New York State. Under the Office of Cannabis Management, though, there are not that many or really no regulations set currently, including a THC cap. So again, these are very important things that we must take into consideration as parents, as people who are going to be having conversations with our young ones about what's happening currently with legislation. So for local opt-out, what does that mean to opt out? So this applies to cities, towns, and villages. You can opt out. So the town of Hempstead can opt out of allowing adult use cannabis retail dispensaries or on-site consumption licenses from locating within their jurisdictions. So that means that we can opt out of having retail sites of cannabis in our town or any places where you can go to actually use cannabis, so a consumption site. Municipalities cannot opt out of adult use legalization as a whole. Those are the only 2 areas that you can actually opt out in the town of Hempstead. So in order to do so, a municipality can pass a local law by December 31st, 2021. If we do not opt out by December 31st, 2021, we will not be able to opt out at a later date. So that is very, very, very important. If we do choose to opt out at any time, we may opt back in. So the town of Hempstead can opt back in if they choose to opt out. Any local law opting out of adult use retail dispensaries or on-site consumption licenses will be subject to a permissive referendum. And this allows voters within the municipality to petition whether or not to approve the law. So very important information for us to know as a community that we do have this option to advocate, if we're interested in doing so, to opt out of having these retail sites in our community and making cannabis more accessible to our teens. So concerns regarding youth usage. Data has shown that legalization does lead to increased social access and a shift in social norms. So statistically, this leads to increases in youth usage overall. And according to the 2021 Monitoring the Future survey, 1 in 4 12th graders indicated that they would now try marijuana or increase their current use if it were legalized. Car crashes related to marijuana, young adult use, and workplace positives are skyrocketing in legal states. THC content overall. So our Surgeon General has actually said this is not your mama's marijuana. So with pot edibles, candies, cookies, ice creams, and waxes that are found in vaping oils being up to 99% THC. That is pretty crazy. Compare that to 1 to 5% of your Woodstock weed 30 to 40 years ago. So it's much more addictive and a much more potent product that is being made available to our teens today. And there's long-term effects. So Dr. Itzkowitz, we're going to hear from in a little bit. He's going to speak to the effects on the developing teen brain. And this is just a quick graph just to show you and give you a visual about youth past month marijuana vaping, which have increased dramatically. So past year youth vaping of marijuana has increased since the Monitoring the Future survey began recording data on the subject in 2017. So as reported by this survey, lifetime annual and past month marijuana vaping among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders have all dramatically increased in just 1 year. Past month use among teenagers have increased over 72% from 2018 to 2019. So more people, more young people are using marijuana in legal states, and that now includes us. They are using it more frequently, and these trends are driven by the decreased perception of risk. So the idea that now that it's legal, it must be safe. Advertisements are largely targeted toward our younger generations because that's really the target market. So they kind of have that advertise first, apologize later mentality. So you're seeing more flavored vape oils, Oreo cookie and cinnamon toast crunch, cannabis concentration products, and synthetic products such as spices and K2. So this is a very, very dangerous idea for our kids, that idea that legal equals safe. And it's very much up to us as a community, up to us as parents, to really unblur these lines for our students and for our children. Accessibility, normalization, this all aids in the exposure of these substances to today's youth. And again, this is just a very quick slide on the overall potency and how this has increased over the last several years. So in the 1970s, we mentioned that Woodstock weed contained roughly between 1 and 3% THC, and that's the psychoactive component of marijuana. Since then, products have become increasingly potent, so driven in part by the market demand as well as a shift in the consumption methods overall. So THC concentrates such as shatter, butter, waxes, gummies, and edibles, they're all packed with more THC than any joint ever was. So now the plant itself is also being genetically engineered to contain a greater percentage of THC. So where we were once seeing between 1 and 3%, we're now seeing 17 to 30% of THC in the plant itself. So the market for the marijuana flower hybrids and concentrates continues to rise with the increase in demand for the products with the higher THC potency levels. And it's especially because these products are being utilized more by the younger generations. They want the edibles, they want the oils and the waxes that they're going to vape and that they can kind of smoke more, secretively. And so it's a little bit more accessible for them. And it's being sold in vape shops, so it's easier for them to access. So again, very important information for us to take into consideration when we're educating ourselves and therefore educating our own children in the process.
Good evening, everybody, and just thank you for having me. I think this is an important topic that we do need to address with regards to how marijuana really affects the adolescent brain. Next slide, please. So in adolescent development, I mean, this is the time in human life between a human being a child and until they become an adult. And it's an amazing time of amazing transition where the person is trying out new things. They're trying to see, what they can do, where they're going to go. They're learning how to develop as a human being, and they usually start taking new experiences and seeing where that's going to take them. However, although a lot of times these adolescents feel that they're indestructible, they can do anything, which is good, but there's also a time where the brain is not fully developed. So going through these processes also has the potential, if they don't do them right, to damage the adolescent health. And some research has actually shown in developmental psychology and neuroscience to demonstrate that extensive reorganization during this time of the brain can explain why there are positive and negative phases and how the adolescent will change into an adult and what they will do. But what we're going to do is give us like an overview of the brain itself. We'll talk about why adolescents might try things, and then at times why they might become addicted to it and have these problems, and then talk about what and how cannabis or marijuana does to the brain and how it can have some long-term effects. So next slide, please. So we're just going to go through this very quickly. We're going to go through the parts of the human brain and their function so we all understand, and then we'll try and address certain more detail of how the marijuana affects the brain and what the long-term effects are. So very superficially, the brain is made up of two parts, the right and the left part, which is like the cerebrum, the outer layer, which is where all those nooks and crannies are, those folds, that's called the cortex. And that cortex is made up of 4 regions, and there are two one on each side. So it's really like 4 for a total of 8. So we'll start out with the frontal lobe, which is the area in yellow. That's actually the last one to be developed. That's the higher learning process of anybody's brain. That controls your personality, your emotions, and higher thinking processes. This is the frontal part is actually not fully developed until we're pretty much in our mid 20s. So even a 20, 21-year-old, their brain, their frontal cortex is still not fully developed. The next part is the temporal lobe, which is the green aspect. That helps process hearing and other senses such as language and reading. The pink area, the parietal lobe, that helps with with your senses, with language and attention. The purple area is the occipital lobe, then the back of the brain. That helps with your vision, your eyes, and helps you assess shapes and colors. A little bit deeper, which we can't see on this picture, is something called the thalamus, which is kind of a relay station that relays sensory and motor information to the cortex so it can acknowledge and assess what it is. It also affects and controls your consciousness and your sleep and your alertness. The brain obviously has 12 cranial nerves, which help control multiple things, such as your facial movements, your eye movements. The cerebellum, which is the bottom part, that brown aspect, is a key role in motor coordination, control, and spatial navigation. And a little lower down is the brainstem. That's made up of a couple of different parts. One of the parts is the pons, which helps control the breathing, and there's the medulla oblongata, which also helps regulate the heart and your body reflexes. And if you we'll talk about it a little bit more in detail, but if we notice that the lower part or the back of the brain actually is kind of develops and controls more of your basic instincts, such as things you don't even think about. And as the brain actually develops, it goes to the cortex, which controls more of the higher learning function, the higher functions that need to develop over time. And that's a lot where the marijuana or other drugs can affect. But a little bit deeper to understand of why adolescents or even anybody would use drugs or even continue to use it is because of part of the brain called the limbic system, which is under the cortex. And this processes emotion, drives, and contains the reward circuit, which the most common neurotransmitter that we'll talk about is something called dopamine. This limbic system includes the amygdala, which processes emotion, and the hippocampus, which helps with memory. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about, I guess, the changes in brain structure. So if you look from the left to the right, you can see the brain from 5 years all the way to 20 years of age. The blue indicates the area of the brains that have fully developed, while the green indicates areas that are still developing. So in a young child, you can see that there's a lot more green, and even like in the 15-year-olds and 20, you can still see areas of green where the brain is still developing. One thing that I can tell you from personal experience that my wife once did, she was once talking to my son when he was a teenager, and he did something, and she kind of explained to him that it's not always his fault because the frontal cortex is not really developed until your mid-20s. Now, I would tell you to be careful based on what you're going to tell your child, because my son's not 25 yet, and to this day, he still throws that in our face, that even if he does something wrong, he goes, "Mommy, Daddy, it's not my fault. My frontal cortex is not developed yet." But you can see that as time goes on, it changes. But even at 20 years of age, you can still see that there is some green of the brain that's still forming. We'll talk about, again, you can see the gray matter volume, and the gray matter makes up the outer part of the brain, which matures from the back of the brain. Like we said, that's the basic part, to the front of the brain, to the frontal cortex, which does the higher learning and makes us grow and learn. It develops earlier than those responsible for the areas of the brain responsible for the behavior, planning, and risk assessment. So like I said, the back of the brain, the cerebellum, the occipital, the brainstem controls the basic functions. As it goes forward to the front of the brain, the cortex, it controls more of the higher learning areas. Next slide, please. Now, to understand what the scans on the prior slide was showing, we need to understand what the different parts of the brain control. So like we said, the back parts of the brain, which develop earlier, include the cerebellum, the occipital lobes, and are most important for having physical coordination and balance and the ability to visually assess our surroundings. That's why, when you think about a child, that usually from the ages of 1 to 2, that's when the child starts learning to walk, getting their balance, because the back brain is kind of developed then. The temporal lobe, which includes, like we were talking about, the amygdala and this other function on the other part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, develops rapidly during childhood and adolescence. And we said the amygdala is responsible for the emotions and registering whether something feels pleasurable or not. And that kind of starts developing 2 or 3, and it kind of goes along with what we hear about, the terrible twos and temper tantrums that young children throw in preschool, because that's starting where that part of the brain is developing. Then the nucleus accumbens, which is near what we call the amygdala, and is part of the reward system. So a lot of things that you hear about is it controls the desire to engage in activities and gives pleasure, which is why rewards via positive feedback, positive reinforcements work, because at that time, when the children are younger, that's when this limbic system starts forming, and it's able to work well with children. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is the front of the brain, which is what we were talking about, it controls the impulse controls, which is really the last thing to function and the last thing to grow. And that happens as we mature, and that part of the brain grows. That's when we learn how to mature better. Next slide, please. So again, trying to understand what happens and why we do certain things, we're going to look at the activation of the reward pathway by addictive drugs. So in this slide, we see that substance use activates the brain's reward pathway. While substances affect different locations of the brain and have different activation mechanisms, they all increase the reward pathway by flooding the part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, with dopamine. And once dopamine activates this area, the nucleus accumbens then sends out messages to other parts of the brain through neurotransmission, and that shows the reward pathway of the addictive drugs. So it goes from one area and then it spreads to the rest of the brain. Next slide, please. So addiction in the brain. Again, this is something that we kind of understand. And again, we mentioned it a couple of times. Dopamine is a natural occurring neurotransmitter in the brain that creates a feeling of happiness and exhilaration. And even the little things that we do now, eating or drinking, it does release dopamine, and it makes it enjoyable for us to do. And like I said, dopamine is part of what's referred to as the reward system, because the pleasurable feelings from dopamine prompt us to repeat those behaviors associated with these feelings. Now, most drugs that are abused, whether they're cocaine, marijuana, heroin, or even alcohol, cause the brain to dump large amounts of dopamine. And a lot of times, it's even up to 10 times of what the brain itself will do from regular things in eating and drinking that we do. Now, this triggers the reward system, providing the person with a feeling of strong euphoria. They enjoy themselves, it feels good. And that explains why people who abuse drugs do so over and over again, because they get that really good feeling. Now, again, as somebody keeps on using drugs, as substance abuse continues, the brain will eventually adapt to the flood of dopamine by producing much less of it, because being that they get a higher dose when they use certain substances, the body will eventually start cutting back on the amount that it produces. Now, even at times where you might need it or there's a steady state of dopamine in the brain, it's less. And once there's a less amount of dopamine, you would get a less euphoric feeling, or generally. And as this happens, this might compel a person to use drugs more frequently or in greater quantities just to feel normal again. And if anyone who's ever spoken to someone who uses any type of substance, they say that after they've used it for a while, just even not using it, they just don't feel well, and they might need it just to get them back up to their baseline. And with these changes, you can see how it's already affecting how the brain works, of why certain things happen. That as you use it, the brain auto-regulates and starts cutting back on the regular neurotransmission that it uses. And eventually, this leads to addiction, because as they keep on using it, it's a vicious cycle. The brain will stop secreting certain neurotransmitters, certain hormones, and eventually it'll almost stop. And in order to get back to a basic feeling of not even feeling happy, just being a normal, the way they were beforehand, they need to use some substance to get them there. So it already starts changing the way the brain and the neurotransmission and the neurotransmitters work. Next slide, please. And what they found is that one of the things that we call marijuana or even those substances are like, cannabinoids. So, but they've actually found that there is what we call endocannabinoids, which are substances that are made inside of the brain. And endocannabinoids are the most prolific neurotransmission in the human body. This was found in a study. And cannabinoid chemicals can be found in the brain and in other body parts. And if it's found in the brain, we call it endogenous. And next slide, please. And if you take a look, like what we just heard before, the major psychedelic substance in marijuana is THC. So the brain's chemical of this endogenous endocannabinoid, one of them is called anandamide, and you can see the structure, how similar THC is to that. So as somebody uses the THC, which looks very similar to this endogenous cannabinoid, it goes and it binds to the brain, and it gives them that high feeling as well. And that's why the THC does that. It kind of mimics the endogenous neurotransmitters that are in the brain. Next slide, please. Now, where are these receptors? So obviously, receptors are all over. Cannabinoid chemicals can be found in the brain and in the body. And most of these, they modulate the neuron and the brain activity in multiple parts of the brain. So we can already see how it really affects the brain, and we just keep on seeing it. And the highest concentration of these receptors that can bind these endogenous cannabinoids and even marijuana or the THC component, they're located in the nucleus accumbens, which is the reward center of the brain. So as you use it, and it's going to focus on the part of the brain that focuses on the reward center, you're going to feel euphoric, you're going to be happy, and it's going to make you want to use it again. The hippocampus also has a high concentration, and that controls your memory and the navigation of spatial orientation. The amygdala, which does fear and emotions, and the cerebellum, which controls coordination and fine movement. Next slide, please. Now, where does marijuana act? This slide gives us more of an explanation of the particular areas. Now, we can see that it goes in the basal ganglia, the cortex, the hippocampus, like we had just spoken, the cerebellum, and that's why when somebody is using marijuana, they always talk about that they have the munchies because it affects the part of the brain, where they eat. A lot of times they're uncoordinated. That's because it's affecting the part of the brain, the cerebellum, the hippocampus, the amygdala, which that helps with memory. That's why they can't remember things at times, or the memory is quite foggy. But there are 2 times in development that appear to be very critical in brain development and functioning. Obviously, one is in the womb through the first few years of child life. The second is by adolescence, where the brain goes through a critical development period where it prunes and makes more connections in the brain to become more efficient. And some parts continue to develop and communicate between other parts, and other parts become more efficient. Now, different impacts if someone starts smoking marijuana after the age of 25 when their brain is already, the frontal cortex and most of the brain is developed, as opposed to a child or adolescent who starts smoking earlier, where the brain is in the middle of developing, it's forming its connections, where these substances can affect the neurotransmitters, it can affect the way the brain is forming and the connections, it could lead to further long-term problems and different changes. Next slide. Now, cannabis and the adolescent brain. Consuming cannabis regularly during adolescence interferes with the function and development of the brain system. Regular cannabis use initiated early in life can result in behavioral and cognitive impairments such as poor academic performance, deficits in attention, information processing, and memory. And this has been found in multiple studies. They said, for example, one of the parts of the brain we were talking about, the hippocampus, is very important to process and encode memory. And being that there are a lot of receptors on the hippocampus, if a child or adolescent is using marijuana that's affecting it, their memory is not as good as it used to be. They can't recall things, and that can lead to long-term effects and how it affects their schooling, how it affects their interactions, and then even long-term. Next slide, please. And then in terms of brain differences in adolescents who use cannabis. So we're going to just quickly speak about structural differences and functional differences. Brain imaging of adolescents who use marijuana has revealed differences in the size, both increase and decrease, connectivity, and quality of various brain structures as compared to adolescents who don't use it. The earlier that individuals start regular use, the more important the nerve connections were in the brain. Those who begin using marijuana at a later stage do not experience the same negative effects because the later it's done, the more the brain has already developed, and it's not going to be affecting major changes. Now, like we said before, connectivity and the way the brain is, it's not fully mature until about the age of 25. And anything that we do that interferes with the development of that connectivity, that impedes the development. Those middle brain structures, like we were talking about, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the very basic animal brain structures, can overpower your tendencies and your actions of the higher order part of the brain, the frontal cortex. And if the frontal cortex isn't really developed well or it's not functioning well, then the basic structures of just doing things because it feels good, doing things because you want to do it, you don't have that structure in the brain to control that area. And then you start and the child, the adolescent, or the person will start doing things that are not necessarily generally accepted because that part of the brain that controls their regular behavior of what they should be doing is not there. Next slide, please. And then what they've even found in terms of the brain differences in adolescents who use it in terms of the functional aspect, and what they found is that increased activity shows that the brain has to work harder to complete a task and call upon other structures of the brain that would not normally be involved. So if they have a child or a person, two different ones, one has been using marijuana, one has not, what they found on imaging studies is that even for a basic activity, the adolescent that has used marijuana has to use more of their brain to do the same type of activity because the functional aspect of certain aspects of the brain are not there. So we see from all these studies and from these imaging studies and work that the structural aspect of the brain is different from an adolescent who has been using cannabis, using marijuana, as opposed to an adolescent who has not been using it. And even functionally, their brain is actually functioning different in an adolescent who has been using marijuana, that they need to pull in more parts of their brain to do basic activities compared to a adolescent who has not been doing anything, who has not been using any substances. Next slide. And I think that's all for me.
Hi, thank you for sharing that. And, you know, as a teacher and looking at all these political and social issues that we're dealing with the legalization of marijuana, we really have to understand that there is that whole piece that we have to hear about the brain and our youth. But I'm going to talk just a couple slides, a few minutes on what we're doing to address this. So in our school district, we've recently provided the community with highlights of the numerous ways we're supporting mental health and wellness for our students K through 12. This includes the new health and wellness program in the elementary level, Oceanside Middle School's new alternative setting classroom, and the construction of a health and wellness center at Oceanside High School. These are but a few examples of the many curriculum, instruction, school-wide practices, and supports at Oceanside School District. There is no doubt Oceanside schools are ahead of the curve in the area of mental health education. Next slide, Allie. Our school district's Drug Advisory and Wellness Council, also known as DAWC, is an active partnership of educators, staff, parents, students, and community members who are committed to helping the citizens of Oceanside acquire skills, gain knowledge, and access resources necessary to live a healthy lifestyle. As a committee, we continue to look for ways to enhance our efforts in regards to the education and prevention. Teaching health in Oceanside for 20 years now, I've seen so much effort go into the area of prevention, from our youngest grades all the way through high school. One thing that does become frustrating is watching my students learn about healthy decision-making and seeing them make positive choices, but then realizing that not all of our community is supporting these efforts. I'm not saying this to assign blame, but we need to come together to make all of Oceanside a safety net for our children, because that is what they deserve. The idea of creating the safety net outside of the schools was actually brought to this district around 5 years ago. I was invited to attend a meeting in the Oceanside Library. At the meeting was Senator Kaminsky, OASIS, which stands for Office of Addiction, Substances and Support, Long Island Prevention Resource Center, and others from our school district. The purpose of the meeting was to pitch the idea of community prevention. Knowing all of the things our district does, I knew we needed to look at this issue through a different lens. Next slide, please. I left that meeting with a renewed sense of hope. This idea of community prevention is that piece that had been missing. When my students left the classroom, I really had no more control of what happened to them, just like for parents when they step out of their homes. This idea of community prevention helped to create that safety net outside of our schools. This is how Oceanside Safe came about. Since that day, we have been meeting monthly at the Oceanside Library, or virtual since COVID, to plan projects, educate the community, stay on top of local drug trends, and support prevention efforts for our youth in Oceanside. In 2019, after a lot of hard work from many coalition members, we were fortunate enough to receive 5 years of funding from the Drug Freeze Community Federal Grant. We are now a funded coalition with a full-time coordinator, Ali Erickson, who started this presentation. Next slide. In order for us to reach our prevention goals, we have brought together the different sectors of the community. Prevention is way too big of a job for one group. We have involvement from our youth, parents, local businesses, media, our school district, youth servicing organizations, law enforcement, religious organizations, civic and volunteer groups, healthcare professionals, and local counseling centers. If there's anyone interested in learning more about Oceanside Safe, please reach out through email or one of our social media platforms. And please do remember that we are all in this together. Here's our social media. So it's our Instagram, our Facebook, our Twitter. If you just Google Oceanside Safe, you'll find that all comes right up. And thank you. We have our next speaker now.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Glickman Rogers. I'm the principal at the middle school. Before we open this up to comments, which you'll post in the chat bar, we do want to take a few minutes to talk to you about protective factors or proactive parenting strategies. So protective factors are factors that will increase the likelihood that your child will not engage in substance abuse. Protective factors make it more likely that your child will be substance-free. And protective factors exist at home, in our community, at school, and there are individual protective factors as well. The first thing that we should note, the fact that you're here tonight is absolutely a protective factor. We hope that you'll have a conversation. Yes?
I'm sorry, we're having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. You're coming in and out on the Wi-Fi. I'm going to also introduce Pam Mizzi, who will help you to present this slide.
Can you hear me now, Ms. Pravito?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So as I was saying, the fact that families are here tonight, that's a protective factor. And we hope that you'll have conversations with your children as a follow-up to tonight's workshop. And during those conversations, you'll set clear expectations for being substance-free. And we hope when the time is right, you'll also talk about consequences at home for using drug and alcohol. And when we say the right time, we mean not waiting until there's a situation where your child has used drugs or alcohol, but beforehand. We know that children who have not used drugs or alcohol in the past 30 days also report. They have a common and a shared characteristic or a common protective factor. They've also expressed that there were clear expectations at home and that they knew that there would be consequences and their parents would not approve. So it doesn't mean your child will not use drugs and alcohol if they know your expectations and they know the consequences, but it does increase the likelihood. Other things we know about at the home is that children who are more engaged in pro-social activities at home, whether it be taking care of a younger child or having job, chores, anything that a child can do at home to help and support the family and contribute to the family, and then be recognized for it and praised for it, that's also a protective factor. Again, the youth development survey that we administered in Oceanside several years ago, those children who did not report using drugs or alcohol during the past 30 days also reported being involved in their home in a positive way and being recognized for that. And the same is true at school. Those children that are involved in activities at school that allow them to explore their strengths, talent, interests, whether it be extracurricular activities, clubs, sports, music programs, art programs, those type of outlets that allow children to feel good and competent, confident, and then again, being recognized by the school or their family for being involved in those activities. Those are protective factors as well. And as far as the peer and the individual, the social skills are so important. Being able to make and keep friends, being able to resist peer pressure through healthy communication skills, and of course, maintaining your mental health and knowing how to be resourceful if you should and are able to recognize signs and symptoms in oneself. If you might be experiencing anxiety or depression, being able to recognize that, seek help, talk to a trusted adult so it's handled in a healthy way will also protect students from using drugs and alcohol. This past week was Red Ribbon Week across the country, and all of our schools in Oceanside celebrated Red Ribbon Week. So I wanted to share with you what our students told us on the morning announcements. This week in school, our theme was Drug-Free Looks Like Me, and students shared why they choose to be drug-free. And a couple of middle school students made announcements each day. And these were some of the protective factors that they learned about in health class that they wanted to share with their peers. Try to find something that you enjoy doing with your extra time and free time. Choose friends that support positive activities in your life. Those are friends that have common or similar values to you that will always help you to get the support you need to make right decisions. And have conversations with your parents or trusted adults about drugs. So your children are waiting for this conversation. They want to have this conversation with you. They know that it will help them to make good decisions. And we ask, and children acknowledge that it's important to choose TV, movies, video games, and other activities that promote healthy activity, healthy ideals, and positive role models. So I'm here with Pam Mizzi, who is an expert in prevention, and I'd ask Pam to share anything else, any other advice for parents to help promote those protective factors at home and with their individual children.
Thanks, Dr. Glickman-Rogers. I think you covered it very nicely, and I'm so glad to hear straight from the kids exactly what they think. They obviously have been thinking about this and are reflecting back what we're teaching them about appropriate use of time and making friends with people that are supportive instead of destructive. But I want to go back to what you first said about parents in educating themselves. It's a very, very important part of the process to be ready to answer questions from your children in a knowledgeable way and in a calm way and an educated way. And using real world examples. You want to stay strong as a parent, find parents who are similarly like-minded as you are to be sure to present a united front between your co-parent and your guardians of your children. Be strong and consistent in your no-use message. It's illegal, it's unhealthy. As a parent, you're responsible for your children's health, and it's your job, and you're going to do it, and you're going to do it well. Take advantage of teachable moments when when you got a bunch of kids in the back seat or when you are alone in the car with your own children. You can ask leading questions, start conversations about alcohol or drug use, talking about recent events in the news or at school, a character on the television show, a situation with family or friends, just to keep lines of communication open and to be sure to be hearing from them where they're at on these issues. You want to encourage your child to share their thoughts and perceptions about what they have heard, and you can correct or augment, where they're at on these issues. You want to be realistic and not use scare tactics, and always be sure to listen to your children. So, there's a host of risk factors that are, very scary, and some of them manageable and some of them unescapable. But we like to focus on the effect, the positive effect of proactive strategies and protective factors. And that's why the coalition started, and that's why the school and social emotional learning and substance abuse prevention just go hand in hand so wonderfully well. So thank you for this opportunity to share.
Welcome all. Welcome back. So we have a great group of people joining us, and we do actually have some questions that came in, and I'd like to share them with you. Anyone who's interested in answering those questions, just hop on in. Before we do that, I just want to let our staff members, those staff members that are actually viewing the presentation right now, know that we did place the attendance link in the chat bar. You must access that link in order to receive the PDP credit. I am seeing several people accessing already, so that's terrific. And now, without further delay, this was the first question that came in. There is someone who wants to know that if they want to advocate for opting out of the two parts of the legislation, what can they do?
So I can start by answering that if you'd like. So what you would want to do is get in touch with your town of Hempstead council members and local legislators as soon as possible and as often as possible before the end of the year. So if you can get on an email notification list, I would definitely do that. Take a look at agendas for the village or town board or city council, see if any of these issues are being spoken about, and then see if you can attend and speak and advocate for your feelings on either why you would want to opt out or just how you feel about opting out overall. If you need any help in gathering data or information about that, definitely get in touch with the Oceanside Safe Coalition or the Long Island Prevention Resource Center. We'd be more than happy to give you any information that you may need to state your case. Writing letters, individual letters, I think speak more profoundly is coming from you as an individual concerned community member. So that would definitely be something that you would want to do. Putting all those things together and doing as much as you can. There's no, minimalistic way to go about this process. And we have a very short amount of time before that decision's made. So to reiterate again, if, town of Hempstead does not opt out before the end of the year, that's it. But if they choose to opt out, then they can opt in at any time. So if they want to take some time to see, because we were saying before that some of those regulations are not put in yet under the Office of Cannabis Management. THC content, there is no cap. So you're going to be seeing a lot of those 99%, edibles and oils and waxes and butters. There's no telling what is going to be in these products that are being purchased and they're on the street. And that can be a very scary notion, because if our kids are getting their hands on these products, if they're being sold to underage students, underage kids, then that's a big problem. That's something that should concern all of us. Pam, go ahead.
Just to follow up on that, after the opt-in, opt-out period is over, the other option available is to address this issue with by zoning. And so there are localities that have already protected their precious downtown property with regulatory zoning practices to make these shops where there is the retail sales in an industrial area instead of in a downtown area. And so whether if it's an opt out, then you don't have to worry about the zoning for the time being. But even if the occasion is that the town of Hempstead opts in, the next step is to regulate by zoning and to have the shops be only in industrial areas. just another idea.
Thank you both. We have a really, really interesting question here. Can the brain heal if an individual stops using marijuana?
So I guess that's directed towards me. So the good thing initially is that we've all seen children, adolescents are very malleable. They bounce back very quickly. So it will depend on how long an individual is using it, because with the brain, unfortunately, when certain connections are made or are not made, it's very hard to go back and relearn certain things. With children, it's a lot easier. Their bodies, their brains are more malleable. They grow. They can change. So if a child is using it a couple of times, it's usually not going to have any long-term effects. If they are using it for long-term effects, there are probably some parts of the brain that cannot be healed. But there are, because the brain is so large and has billions and trillions of connections, even if it can't make one here or there, or this one is frozen in time where it can't heal itself, it can make other connections. So the short answer is, if someone's using it for a relatively short amount of time, just trying it habitually once in a while, it's probably not going to cause any long-term severe damage. But it will always do some harm. But if it's not long-term, the body and the brain generally can heal and find other pathways to adjust. But again, that's not something that should really be publicized, to our children who don't really understand that. But at this point, if it's not a habitual user, it's not being done like every day, every other day, the body can heal. But again, I don't know if there's any real definite studies that show that, but not using, stopping at a certain time will give the body and the brain time to heal up. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. We have we'll do one or two more questions. The next one: how do I start the conversation with my child about the dangers of marijuana? When I try, he gets upset and he tells me I am overreacting.
Ms. Pravito, I would suggest asking what you learned in school about marijuana and marijuana usage, and has the school discussed with you that even though they might have learned in social media or through the news that marijuana is legal, has the school discussed with you why it is illegal for children? So maybe put it back on the school. And it was Red Ribbon Week, so you have that's an in right there, if that helps.
And I was going to say that, for some people, and again, it's an uncomfortable conversation for a lot, but starting these conversations at a young age, so it's not awkward, it's not abnormal by the time they get to those teenage years where they do, that's stupid, you don't know anything. If those conversations start young, then it wouldn't be an awkward conversation at that age. So I know some people are just, if this is your first time learning about this and you have a high school student, it might take a little more time to open up that pathway of communication. But like, I have 3 of my own kids, and we started talking about, the dangers of drugs and specific drugs definitely in elementary school. And now we talk about it all the time, and there's not really that, hesitation, or you don't know what obviously I'm a health teacher, so they kind of know, I know what I'm talking about, but that's my advice. Just start really young.
So, and there are a couple of different good websites that have sample discussions on them for parents to try out different ways of approaching it. If you're uncomfortable, they advise to not talk about your own experience. You're not talking about you. You're talking about them. Stand firm. Continue to just keep the communication open. Drugfree.org is the one that comes to mind right away, but there are different scenarios for different age groups that are readily available online with just this kind of information.
Ms. Pravito, could we address, there's one question that asks if we feel that marijuana or alcohol are a gateway drug.
I'm going to go ahead and post that. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I, maybe Dr. Itzkowitz, other people want to join. I think that's been debated, recently, but I think the more important thing to focus on is that the earlier a person is when they use any substance, whether it's alcohol or marijuana, the more likely they are to have an addiction. The older you are, the less likely. So, we really want to focus on that with children, whether it's alcohol or marijuana. The young children, adolescents, high school students, the earlier you are, the younger you are, the earlier in life, the more likely it is that you will face addiction.
Yes,
I mean,
I would agree with
yeah.
that, because, like I said, in the information that I presented with the pathway of using drugs, when you're younger, you have that rush, that euphoria of the neurotransmitters of what's making you feel really good, and being that you don't have like the higher function yet, because that doesn't develop until later. Once you get that good feeling, you want to keep it going. So, listen, even in medicine, there are a lot of studies that are done that show things that I do that I don't do, and even if a study shows something that goes a certain way, in my experience, if I see that it goes like another way, I'll follow what my experience as well. So, in experience that I've seen, children that do start earlier do have that feeling of euphoria. It feels good, and they want to keep it going. So, in my opinion, it does lead to using other substances, whether it's alcohol, which is still legal, but it does give them that. Oh, if I feel good with this, let me try something else. So whether the studies show that it is a gateway drug or not, I think from my experience that I've seen in my community and in the hospitals that I've been working for about 20 years, when you do ask these adolescents or even young adults what they've been doing, how long they've been doing substances for, you do get the sense that this wasn't like a one-time thing. That it started out with one, then it led to the next, then it led to the next.
So I think that we'll answer just one more question because it is in the chat bar, and then we will close our presentation. And this one is, how do we know whether our own municipality is opting out, or do we know?
So I know that several different municipalities have already opted out. I know that Rockville Center recently has, I believe Freeport and Pam, I think there was a few more that have opted out already. So they have until the end of the year to make a decision, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to wait until the end of the year to make that decision, which is why if you do feel that this is something that you want to advocate for, to not have retail dispensaries and not have areas for consumption sites in the town of Oceanside, the sooner the better to get your voice heard would definitely be what you would like to do. I mean, I would think, Pam, I'm sure that there's an announcement that's made. That's
well, the Oceanside being an unincorporated village, the decision goes up to the township, which is why Rockville Center being an incorporated, being a city, they were able to decide on their own. And it was a smaller group of people, they got it done quickly. So for the town of Hempstead, I will strongly suggest that anybody who is interested in finding out more about how to participate in this opt-out process, speak to the public health department. And the guy's name is Barry Wilansky, and his phone number is 516-812-3251. That's the Department of Public Health for the Township of Hempstead. And he is someone who does know a little bit more about what the town is doing on opt-in, opt-out. And he is the public health representative for the town. And he's very aware of coalition activities. I'm sure he'd be glad to hear from you. He'll kill me for giving you phone numbers. But he really wants to know what people think, and he'll field your phone call appropriately, I'm sure.
We won't tell him where we got the number, Pam.
It's only broadcast on YouTube, but that's okay.
Fine.
So at this time, I cannot thank our wonderful panelists, our expert and dedicated panelists, Dr. Glickman, Miss Mizzy, Dr. Itzkowitz, Dr. Allison Erickson, and Sarah Dowler. We did have a wonderful group of people who were attending the chat bar. The comment bar was alive and well. We thank you for your attention, your care, your dedication to our youth and keeping them healthy. And we wish you all a good night. Thank you for tuning in.